August 3, 1943. Sicily. The heat inside the hospital tent was unbearable. The sun burned the canvas roof like fire, trapping the air inside. Sweat ran down faces. The smell of blood, iodine, and fear mixed together. Flies hovered over wounded men lying on stretchers. Some whispered prayers. Some groaned in pain. Others stared at the ceiling, already halfway between life and death. This place was supposed to be safe. In war, the hospital tent was sacred ground. No shouting. No violence. No rank. Only healing. But that peace was about to be destroyed. Heavy footsteps approached the entrance. The nurses stiffened. The doctors looked up. A shadow fell across the tent flap. General George S. Patton stepped inside. He looked like a warrior from another age. His helmet was polished. His uniform was perfect. 2 ivory-handled revolvers rested on his hips. He walked with confidence, like a man who believed he was born for war. Many soldiers admired him. Some feared him. All respected him. Patton walked slowly between the stretchers. He stopped to speak with wounded men. He asked about their injuries. He praised their courage. He smiled when he heard stories of blood and sacrifice. This was the war he understood. Then he moved to the next man. And everything changed. The soldier was not lying on a stretcher. He was sitting on a wooden supply box. He looked young. Too young. His uniform was dirty, but there was no blood. No bandages. No visible wounds. His name was Private Charles H. Cole. The soldier stared at the ground. His hands shook. Sweat covered his face even though he felt cold. His body trembled, not from pain but from something deeper. Patton stopped in front of him. The general's shadow swallowed the soldier completely. Patton looked down and asked a simple question. "Where are you wounded?" The soldier did not look up. I guess I just can't take it," he whispered. "It's my nerves, sir." The words hung in the air. Inside the tent, time seemed to stop. The wounded men stopped groaning. The doctors stopped working. The nurses froze, trays shaking in their hands. Everyone knew something terrible was coming. Patton's face changed. The calm commander vanished. His eyes hardened. His jaw tightened. He did not see a sick man. He saw weakness. And in Patton's mind, weakness was more dangerous than the enemy. Then it happened. The slap echoed through the tent like a gunshot. Patton struck the soldier across the face with his gloved hand. It was not light. It was violent. The soldier's helmet liner flew off and hit the ground. He fell back stunned. The soldier began to cry. That sound, crying, pushed Patton even further. He grabbed the young man by the collar and pulled him up. His face was inches away now. Spit flew as he shouted. "I won't have a coward sitting here crying." The doctors watched in horror. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Patton shoved the soldier back down. His hand dropped to his revolver. For one terrifying second, everyone thought the same thing. The general might actually kill him. "I'll shoot you myself," Patton roared. "You're going back to the front. And if you don't fight, I'll have you executed." The soldier sobbed harder. His body shook uncontrollably. A doctor finally stepped forward, his hands trembling. But Patton turned on him too. He shouted that there was no such thing as battle shock. He ordered the staff to throw the soldier out of the hospital. Then Patton stormed out of the tent. The flaps slammed shut. The heat returned. The flies returned. But the silence remained. The doctors looked at the soldier on the ground. They knew the truth. He was not a coward. He was sick. He had malaria. His fever was over 102 degrees. And they also knew something else. What they had just witnessed was a crime. The most feared general in the American army had just crossed a line. But this was only the beginning. Because this was not just about anger. It was about a man who believed war was sacred. A man who believed fear was a sin. A man who thought mercy was weakness. And the entire American army was about to feel the consequences of that belief. Because one slap in a hot tent in Sicily would soon reach the desk of the most powerful general in the world, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. After storming out of the tent, General George S. Patton walked back to his jeep. His boots crushed the dust of Sicily. The sun scorched his helmet and sweat ran down his face. But Patton didn't feel the heat. He felt something far hotter: rage. It was a fire that had been burning inside him for days, weeks, months. A fire that demanded obedience. A fire that demanded glory. Patton was not a man who understood weakness. He believed that fear was a choice. Pain was temporary. And hesitation was treason. Every man in his army had to be strong, fearless, and ready to fight always. If a soldier fell down not because of injury but because of exhaustion or fear, Patton saw it as a betrayal. To him, a trembling man was a traitor to his country. Sicily in 1943 was no ordinary battlefield. It was a furnace both physically and politically. On one side there was the British General Bernard Montgomery, calm, cautious, careful, and methodical. Montgomery's soldiers moved slowly, measured each step, and reported every casualty. Patton despised this approach. To him, speed was life. Aggression was survival. Hesitation was death. He was determined that America would not lose glory to the British, even if the Germans were still the real enemy. Patton had been awake for days without proper sleep. His body was fueled by adrenaline, caffeine, and a fierce obsession with victory. Every hour of rest seemed wasted. Every moment of doubt threatened the mission. He drove his men harder than any commander before him. He expected them to march without complaining, to fight without question, to die without hesitation. And yet, inside the hospital tent, he had seen something that filled him with fury, a soldier who could not take it. Patton's mind replayed the image over and over. The boy on the box, his head bowed, shaking. The way he had muttered, almost whispering, "I can't take it, sir." Patton's eyes burned at the memory. How could a man survive in a world of artillery shells, machine guns, and tanks if he could not endure the heat of fear? To Patton, courage was not optional. Survival was not enough. Victory demanded warriors. Anything less was shame. And shame, he believed, spread like fire. If one man could break, others would follow. If weakness was allowed to exist, it would destroy the entire army. It was not only anger at the soldier. It was the pressure of the campaign itself. Sicily was a race. The Allies had landed in July 1943, and the objective was clear: capture the island, take Messina, and prepare the path for Italy. But the clock was relentless. Patton knew that British forces were moving too slowly. Montgomery's cautious approach made headlines in London. The Americans needed to arrive first to secure honor and glory. Patton felt that every day lost was not only a tactical loss, it was a stain on American pride. The tent incident was only a spark. The gunpowder was already in place. Patton's ego, his obsession with speed, and his relentless drive for recognition had created a storm. And now that storm had an outlet. Back at headquarters, Patton's staff waited nervously. Officers who had spent years studying strategy and tactics did not know what to say. They had witnessed the slap. They had heard the threats. But they also knew the general. They knew that Patton was unmatched in battlefield skill. If he wanted victory in Sicily, he was the man to have. But he was also unpredictable, volatile, and terrifying. Colonel Donald Currier, a senior doctor, tried to intervene. "Sir," he had said, trembling, "he is sick, he has malaria." Patton had spun on him, his voice like a whip. "I don't care if he has malaria. No man can let sickness or fear rule him. There is no shell shock. There is only the weak." The words echoed through the dusty tent. The staff could only watch. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were healers. Yet here was a man, a general, taking justice into his own hands. Patton walked away from the hospital, but the soldiers he had slapped would stay in his mind. He did not feel guilt. He felt righteous anger. To him, he had saved them from weakness. He had returned courage to them, even if it had been violent and cruel. That night, as he wrote in his diary, Patton justified the incident. "I have saved these men's souls," he scribbled. "Weakness cannot be tolerated. Victory cannot wait. Glory cannot be denied." But the ripple effect had already begun. Whispers traveled through the army. Soldiers spoke in low voices about what had happened. Some were shocked. Some admired the general's courage. Others feared what could happen next. And yet, beyond Sicily, in the calm halls of Allied command, a different storm was brewing. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, would soon read the reports. He would see the slap, the threats, and the names of soldiers who were not cowards but sick. Eisenhower understood men, he understood diplomacy, and he understood the cost of losing public support. He also understood Patton. Patton was a sword, sharp and dangerous. You did not throw away a sword because it cut you. But a sword left unchecked could cut anyone. Eisenhower had to choose: discipline Patton and risk slowing the war, or restrain his anger and harness his brilliance. And this was the tension of Sicily, 1943. A general driven by rage, ambition, and obsession, against a world that demanded both compassion and victory. A battlefield where men would break physically and mentally, and the difference between life and death was not only skill and courage, but a single moment of anger in a sweltering hospital tent. Patton believed in one rule above all else: fear was a choice. Courage was mandatory. And in Sicily there was no room for weakness. But the consequences of that belief would not remain in Sicily. The tent had been the first act. The army, the nation, and history would all soon bear witness to what happens when a man like Patton loses control. And as the Mediterranean sun set over the island, the soldiers of the 15th Evacuation Hospital knew one chilling truth. This was not the last time Patton's fury would strike. Because war, Patton believed, was a test of souls. And he had decided who would pass, and who would fail. 1 week after the first incident, the heat of Sicily had not cooled, and neither had the tension within the ranks. The dust of the battlefield clung to the soldiers' boots and faces like a second skin. The 93rd Evacuation Hospital was eerily quiet under the midday sun. Patton arrived once again, his presence commanding attention even before he entered the tent. Soldiers straightened their posture. Nurses stiffened, gripping trays of instruments. Doctors paused mid-suture. Whispers circulated, "The general is here." Patton's appearance was flawless. The polished boots, the gleaming helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers, all radiated authority and danger. But today, beneath that disciplined exterior, a simmering anger still lingered. He had come not just to visit, but to remind the army that courage was a requirement, not a suggestion. He walked the rows of beds and cots, asking about injuries, handing out cigarettes, exchanging a few words of encouragement. To the casual observer, he appeared calm and collected. A man in control. Yet, under the surface, the same storm from the previous week raged in his mind. And then he saw him. Private Paul G. Bennett. Bennett's uniform was stained, his face pale and damp with sweat. His body trembled violently as he sat on the edge of a cot, staring at nothing. His eyes were wide, haunted, and vacant. The trauma of battle was etched into every line of his face. Days earlier, an artillery shell had decapitated the soldier's friend. Sleep had abandoned him. Fear had claimed him. But Patton did not see trauma. He saw weakness. The moment their eyes met, the atmosphere in the tent thickened. Soldiers held their breath. Nurses clutched instruments tighter. Even the seasoned doctors, accustomed to the horrors of war, froze in anticipation. Patton approached Bennett slowly. The general's shadow swallowed the young soldier, as if warning him of the power standing mere inches away. "What's your trouble, son?" Patton asked, his voice deceptively calm, almost gentle. "It's my nerves, sir," Bennett whispered. His voice trembled. I can't stand the shelling anymore." Patton's eyes narrowed. Rage, hotter than the Sicilian sun, surged through him. "You yellow coward," he shouted, his calm evaporating in an instant. "I won't have men like you in my army." The first slap came like a hammer. Bennett's head snapped back. The sound echoed in the tent. Nurses gasped. Doctors froze. The young soldier began to cry uncontrollably. But that was not enough for Patton. The second strike landed harder. His gloves connected with unforgiving force. Bennett fell back, clutching his face, trembling like a leaf in a storm. The soldiers around them could only watch, powerless. Patton's fury was a force of nature. He grabbed Bennett by the collar, his voice cracking with wrath. "If you don't fight, I'll see to it that you die myself." Bennett's sobs filled the tent. Every medical professional there understood what was happening. This was beyond discipline. This was cruelty. This was a general breaking the unwritten law of war, that the hospital tent, above all else, was neutral ground. A doctor stepped forward, hands shaking. "Sir, he's sick. He's broken. Mentally, yes, but he is not a coward." Patton spun on him like a whip. "No man has the right to be weak. Throw him out." And so they did. Bennett was dragged to the dirt outside, falling into the Sicilian heat. Patton stood above him, towering, resolute. To him he was delivering a lesson. To everyone else he had crossed a line. The irony was cruel. Bennett's mind had already been broken by the war, yet now his body was subjected to the violence of a general he was meant to obey. And all the while, Patton believed he was saving him, saving his spirit, restoring courage through terror. Inside the tent, the mood was grim. The medical staff exchanged worried glances. They knew that the first incident with Private Cole had already been reported up the chain of command. Now 2 reports existed, incidents of assault by the highest-ranking general in the American Army. The whispers had become a murmur. Soon they would become a roar. The soldiers outside the tent stared at Bennett as he struggled to rise. They had seen courage under fire, heroism in the face of death, but never this. The sheer unpredictability of Patton's temper left them both awed and terrified. And yet, even as the young soldier suffered, Patton walked away without a backward glance. His mind was already focused on the next objective. The race to Messina, the pressure to outpace the British, the obsession with glory. There was no room in his mind for guilt, only for victory. That evening, Patton wrote in his diary justifying his actions. I have awakened the courage that was nearly lost. Weakness cannot survive in my army. I will not tolerate hesitation, not even for one man. Glory and victory demand relentless action. But Eisenhower would see the reports differently. Where Patton saw courage, Eisenhower would see recklessness. Where Patton saw necessity, Eisenhower would see a breach of law and morality. The general had created not just a storm in Sicily, but a storm that would reach the very top of Allied command. And while Patton thought he had saved these men from cowardice, history would later question. Did he save them or did he almost destroy them? For Private Bennett, the memory of the second slap would linger for the rest of his life. The humiliation, the fear, the terror, all etched deep into his soul. And yet, like Private Cole before him, he would survive. He would return to duty, to the front lines, and fight. Patton, however, remained unshaken. To him, every tear, every cry, was fuel for his war machine. Every trembling soldier was a spark that ignited his fury, a test of his own relentless will. The echoes of the slap would not fade quietly. They would travel through the ranks, through reports, through whispers, until they reached the desk of Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who understood both the battlefield and the delicate balance of public perception. And when Eisenhower read the reports, he would face a choice that could determine the course of the war itself. Would he punish Patton? Or would he harness his fury for the sake of victory? The answer would shape history. Because in Sicily, 1943, the line between heroism and cruelty was razor-thin. And General George S. Patton had just stepped over it twice. The storm was far from over. The news arrived slowly, like a shadow creeping through the marble corridors of Allied headquarters. Reports from Sicily, carefully typed and sealed, made their way up the chain of command. Every word carried weight, every detail mattered. And at the very top, in the cool offices far from the dust and heat of battle, Dwight D. Eisenhower read. He read about Private Charles Cole. The slap. The screams. The threats. He read about Private Paul Bennett. The trembling, the sobbing, the violent backhand that left a young soldier broken in both body and spirit. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, hands gripping the edges like a man bracing for an impact. He had commanded armies before, had led men through fire and mud, but this was different. This was a problem not of strategy, not of tactics, not of logistics. This was a problem of the human soul. Patton was brilliant. Unmatched in speed, unmatched in aggression, unmatched in the art of armored warfare. When he drove his men, when he commanded tanks and artillery, he could win battles others would lose. He could inspire fear in the enemy and awe in his own troops. Patton was a weapon. A razor-sharp, dangerous weapon. But Patton was also unpredictable. He was a force of nature, and forces of nature cannot be controlled. Eisenhower knew that discipline could not be based on fear alone. He understood the delicate balance between authority and justice. Soldiers could fight because they respected their leaders, but if leaders became tyrants, if fear replaced honor, the army would crumble from within. And yet, Patton's actions could not be ignored. 2 young soldiers, wounded and sick, had been assaulted by the most powerful man in the American army. The reports were damning. Any public knowledge of these incidents could destroy morale, could ignite a scandal that would weaken the war effort. Eisenhower sighed. He had no simple choice. If he punished Patton publicly, he would remove the most effective general in the theater. The Germans would sense weakness. The British might claim victory before the Americans even reached Messina. Months of planning, thousands of lives at stake could unravel. But if he did nothing, if he allowed the assault to go unpunished, what would that say to the army? To the families of soldiers? To the nation? The American public would see the army condoning brutality. Discipline would erode. Soldiers would lose faith in leadership. And Eisenhower ultimately would be blamed. He rubbed his temples, weighing the scales of duty and morality. The choice was almost unbearable. Then he remembered the battlefield. Not the office, not the maps, not the reports, but the soldiers themselves. Thousands of young men fighting in the mud and blood of Sicily, facing death every day. They needed Patton. They needed his brilliance, his speed, his unyielding aggression. Without him, victory might be delayed, and delay would cost more lives than even a moment of cruelty. Eisenhower made a decision. A hard decision. He would not remove Patton from command. Not yet. Instead, he would act as a father, a mentor, a mirror. He would hold up the truth of Patton's actions not as a punishment but as a warning. He would demand reflection, apology, accountability, and he would do it privately. Public scandal could not be allowed. The Supreme Commander dictated a letter himself. Each word was deliberate, each sentence measured. "I am clearly questioning your judgment," Eisenhower wrote. "I do not expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to be fair. I am aware of the necessity for toughness on the battlefield, but brutality, abuse of the sick and uncontrolled temper cannot be excused. Your actions, if reports are true, must be addressed." He chose not to send the letter via telegraph. Not for security, not for speed, but for impact. He wanted Patton to hold the paper in his own hands. He wanted him to feel the weight of every word. Back in Sicily, Patton received the letter. For the first time, he did not feel the fire of rage. Instead, he felt something foreign: fear. Not of the Germans. Not of artillery shells. Not of tanks. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that his career, his legacy, his life's work, could end on the floor of a Sicilian hospital tent. Patton read the words carefully. He reread them. Then, slowly, he understood. He had gone too far. His brilliance, his aggression, his drive for glory, had almost destroyed everything he had built. But Eisenhower did not demand immediate apology. Not yet. Instead, he left the path open. Patton could act. He could apologize. He could repair the damage. Or he could ignore it, and risk losing not only the trust of his superiors, but the command he cherished above all else. The tension in Patton's mind was unbearable. He was a man of action. Yet the battlefield he now faced was one of words, letters, and subtle power. The war he had been fighting with tanks and artillery was nothing compared to the war within himself. The soldiers in Sicily waited, unaware of the drama unfolding above them. The heat, the dust, the sweat. They did not know that the fate of their general, their campaigns, and even their own lives depended not only on courage in battle, but on a few sheets of paper and the judgment of a man thousands of miles away. Patton could have reacted with defiance. He could have stormed Eisenhower's office. He could have refused to apologize. He could have let his temper run wild again. But the general, for all his rage, understood strategy, survival, victory. And he knew deep down that the only way forward was to submit temporarily to a power greater than his own. Eisenhower's letter was more than a reprimand. It was a challenge, a test of character. Could Patton control his fury? Could he bend without breaking? Could he survive the wrath of his own brilliance? The answers would come in the days that followed. Apologies would be demanded. Pride would be tested. And history would be watching, even if the world did not yet know the drama that had unfolded behind the scenes of one of the most important campaigns of World War II. Because Sicily had shown one truth: Georgius Patton was not just a general. He was a force that could win battles, shape campaigns, and terrify both friend and foe. But he was also a man who could almost destroy himself with a single act of uncontrolled rage. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who held the responsibility of the free world on his shoulders, would have to guide him. Carefully. Strategically. Like a chess master moving the most dangerous piece on the board. The storm was far from over. The days after Eisenhower's letter were heavy with tension. Patton, the general who had stormed the sands of Sicily with unstoppable fury, now faced a different kind of battlefield, the court of perception. His pride, his ego, his very identity as a man of action was on trial. The order came: he must apologize. Not for strategy. Not for the victories he had achieved. But for striking soldiers who had already suffered enough. Patton, the lion of the battlefield, felt trapped. To admit wrongdoing felt like defeat. Yet he had no choice. In the blistering heat of August 1943, Patton stood before thousands of soldiers in formation. The sun beat down on the troops, glinting off rifles and helmets. Thousands of eyes watched, waiting, anticipating the speech of the man they called Old Blood and Guts. Patton mounted the platform, looking smaller than usual. The ivory-handled revolvers were absent. Gone was the swagger, the fearsome presence. Instead, he appeared tense, awkward, even human. "My men," he began, his voice high-pitched, almost squeaky to those who had only known the roar of his command. I have made mistakes." The words were strange, almost foreign to him. He explained, fumbling, that he had acted out of concern for the army, for courage, for the war effort. That he had believed, perhaps wrongly, that he was inspiring bravery. Some soldiers cheered. They had always admired his boldness, his unrelenting drive. Others, however, remained silent, unsure whether to feel relief, anger, or confusion. Patton moved on to the hospitals, finding Private Cole and Private Bennett. He shook their hands, muttering awkward words of regret. The young soldiers nodded, their expressions a mixture of relief, disbelief and lingering pain. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower watched closely. The apology had to appear sincere, yet it also had to preserve Patton's effectiveness. The delicate balance was critical. The public could not see a broken army, but the general could not be allowed to become a liability. Meanwhile, in Sicily, whispers of the incident had begun to spread. But the press, hungry for scandal, had been corralled by an unspoken agreement with Eisenhower. Journalists had been told, "Do not print this story. Lives depended on it. The war depended on it. The world would never know the violence inside those tents, at least not yet." Patton's temporary humiliation served a purpose. It was a lesson in discipline, a reminder that even the greatest warriors were accountable. Yet even as he apologized, his mind was already turning to the next battle. He would not remain in disgrace for long. The Germans, however, were watching. They saw a general publicly humbled and assumed a shift in American command. They believed this was a ruse, a clever deception to hide the real plans of the Allies. They imagined Patton preparing for a massive, secret offensive. The perception of Patton's restraint created fear, confusion, and uncertainty among the Axis command. Eisenhower understood this instinctively. He had crafted a subtle yet brilliant plan. Patton's absence from the front lines became a tool of deception. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, was built around him, but not for real. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and empty tents created the illusion of a massive force poised to strike Pas-de-Calais. Patton was the figurehead, the ghost of an army designed to mislead the enemy. Patton hated it. Every day in exile, he paced the floors of his villa in England, furious that he was not allowed to fight. The man who thrived on motion, on aggression, on battle, was now a pawn in a psychological game. He drank heavily, scribbled dark thoughts in his diary, and brooded over the humiliation of the apology tour. Yet, unbeknownst to him, his enforced inactivity was serving the war effort perfectly. Back in Sicily, soldiers returned to the front lines, unaware of the delicate dance occurring behind the scenes. The hospital tents were quiet once again, the dust settling on the aftermath of Patton's wrath. Private Cole, Private Bennett, and countless others had survived, scarred yet alive. Eisenhower's strategy was working. Patton, the unpredictable force of nature, was contained just enough to protect the larger goal, the upcoming invasion of France. The Germans were convinced the greatest threat would appear at the wrong place in the wrong time. The real D-Day would come, and Patton's ghost army would be a key instrument in its success. Yet, despite the deception, the human cost remained. Patton's fury had almost destroyed him, and it had certainly scarred the soldiers under his command. For every strategic advantage gained, there was a personal toll, a reminder that war is never clean, never simple. The apology, the silence of the press, and the ghost army deception were not merely administrative moves. They were acts of war, psychological operations as lethal as any tank or artillery barrage. Patton's personal torment became a weapon, Eisenhower's guidance a shield, and the world remained unaware of the storm that had just passed. The stage was set. Patton was ready, or at least the world would believe he was. And when the real battle came, the man who had been humbled, controlled, and exiled would return not as a diplomat, not as a penitent, but as the unstoppable force history had feared. But for now, Patton waited, fuming in silence. The ghost of his own fury haunted him, and the shadow of his actions in Sicily loomed large. The story was far from over. The spring of 1944 in England was gray and cold, but the tension in the air was hotter than the Mediterranean sun of Sicily. Georges Patton, the general who had been humbled, controlled, and exiled, sat in a manor house, staring out the frost-covered windows. The silence around him was suffocating. No tanks. No troops. No action. Just him, pacing the floorboards like a caged lion. For months he had been a ghost. The Allies had created the illusion of a massive force in southeastern England, the 1st United States Army Group, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and empty tents. Patton's reputation alone made the Germans tremble, but the general himself was imprisoned by strategy, forced to wait while the real D-Day assault was planned. Patton hated it. Every fiber of his being screamed for motion, for speed, for battle. He scribbled in his diary, scrawling dark thoughts about glory, frustration, and impatience. To a man who thrived on action, this inactivity was torture. Yet, paradoxically, he understood the necessity. Every delay, every deception, every strategic maneuver preserved lives on both sides, even if he did not feel it in his chest. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The beaches of Normandy were soaked in blood, sand, and chaos. The greatest armada in human history pushed across the English Channel, thousands of soldiers risking everything for the promise of victory. Patton listened to reports on the radio, his fists clenched, jaw tight. He was not there. The man whose courage could have led men ashore was sidelined. His opportunity to strike, to inspire, to dominate had been delayed. The news from the front was grim. American forces were pinned, struggling through hedgerows, bogged down by enemy fire. The British were stalled. The Allies needed a breakthrough. Eisenhower, watching the unfolding disaster, knew the time for patience was over. He picked up the phone and called the man who had once struck soldiers in Sicily, the man whose fury could turn the tide of battles. "George, how fast can you move?" Patton's eyes burned with fury and anticipation. He calculated almost instantly the movement of divisions, supply lines, and terrain. "Sir, I can strike with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he replied, calm but deadly. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The room erupted with disbelief. 3 divisions in 48 hours? The logistics alone seemed impossible. Yet Eisenhower knew better. Patton never spoke lightly. Patton always delivered. Within hours, the Third Army was mobilized. Tanks rolled across frozen fields, artillery followed, and infantry advanced at a pace that seemed unreal. Patton's mind worked like a machine, anticipating German movements, exploiting gaps, and turning the enemy's confidence into chaos. For the Germans, this was unexpected. They had believed Patton sidelined, a spectator to the greatest invasion in history. Now he appeared like a force of nature, striking their flanks, encircling divisions, capturing towns almost faster than intelligence could track. Panic spread through the German command. Their meticulously planned defenses crumbled under the relentless assault. Patton's men, inspired by his presence, moved faster, fought harder, and never looked back. The general's reputation as old blood and guts became reality in every skirmish, every charge, every maneuver. His aggression, once a liability in Sicily, had become the key to rapid Allied advancement. Through the chaos, Patton never lost his edge. His tactical brilliance combined with unyielding drive turned what could have been a long, costly campaign into a lightning-fast series of victories. Town after town fell. Supply lines were disrupted. Entire enemy divisions surrendered. The Third Army moved like a wildfire across France, unstoppable, devastating, brilliant. Meanwhile, back in Washington and London, Eisenhower watched the reports in awe. Patton, the man who had been a liability, the man whose rage had caused scandal, was now the instrument of victory. His fury, his obsession, his willingness to push men to their limits, all of it had been necessary. He had been restrained, shaped, guided, and now unleashed at precisely the right moment. Even as the victories piled up, Patton remained restless. He did not celebrate. He did not rest. He drove his men relentlessly, always forward, always advancing, always seeking the next objective. His energy was terrifying, his methods brutal, but the results were undeniable. Lives were saved by speed. The war that could have dragged on for months or years was shortened by days and weeks. And so, the man who had been humiliated, who had apologized, who had been exiled to England, became the savior of the Allied advance. The ghost of Sicily, the young soldiers he had struck, the apology tour, the press silence, faded into the background, replaced by maps covered in arrows, reports of towns liberated, and the unstoppable drive of the Third Army. But even in victory, the shadow of his past actions lingered. Patton was a hero, a savior, and a monster all at once. He had driven men beyond limits, forced obedience with fear, and yet his brilliance had saved Europe. The war had demanded a man who could balance genius with madness, and for better or worse, Patton had been exactly that man. The stage was set for the next challenge, the next test of skill, courage, and fury. The war was far from over, but one thing was certain. Wherever Patton went, victory followed, and fear accompanied him. Winter 1944. Europe was cold, bitter, and chaotic. The Allied forces, having advanced across France with unprecedented speed under Patton's command, faced their toughest challenge yet, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans, desperate and cunning, launched a massive surprise attack in the Ardennes. The American lines shattered under the onslaught. Tanks were overturned. Soldiers were surrounded. Panic rippled through the Allied command. Communications faltered. Supplies ran low. The situation seemed dire. Eisenhower convened his generals. Maps were spread across the table, frozen fingers tracing enemy movements. "George," he said, voice tense, "how fast can you strike their flank?" Patton leaned over the map, eyes burning with intensity. He had anticipated such a move. His mind raced through possibilities, contingencies, terrain, and speed. "Sir," he said calmly, "I can move 3 divisions 90 miles in 48 hours through the snow. We can hit them before they expect it." The room fell silent. 3 divisions in 48 hours? It sounded impossible, absurd even. But Patton had always done the impossible. Eisenhower knew he had no choice. The Third Army roared back into action. Tanks cut through snow-covered roads. Infantry advanced at a pace that defied logic. The Germans, confident in their initial gains, were blindsided by the sudden, relentless strike. Patton's forces smashed into their flank, encircled divisions and liberated besieged towns. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had been trapped for days, surrounded and running low on supplies. Patton's arrival was nothing short of miraculous. Snow whipped around armored vehicles as soldiers cheered. The relief was palpable. Men who had faced despair now saw hope. Patton's genius and aggression had turned the tide once again. Even in the midst of victory, Patton was relentless. He did not pause to celebrate. He drove forward, pushing his men, ignoring exhaustion, fatigue, and danger. His obsession with speed and decisive action saved countless lives, shortening the war and preventing further unnecessary slaughter. Yet, the man who had once struck soldiers in a Sicilian hospital tent remained haunted by his past. Private Cole, Private Bennett, the boys he had slapped, were reminders of the darker side of his character. Patton understood that leadership demanded toughness, sometimes brutality, but it came at a personal cost. He was both savior and tormentor. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The Third Reich lay in ruins. Patton, standing amid the wreckage, looked at the destroyed cities, shattered vehicles, and exhausted soldiers. He had achieved what few could, crushing the enemy, liberating occupied territories, and securing victory. Yet he was not the triumphant, carefree general he might have imagined. The ghost of his own temper, his mistakes, and his obsession with glory lingered. December 1945. Patton, having survived artillery, tanks, and battles that had destroyed nations, met his final challenge, not in combat but in fate. A car accident in Germany left him paralyzed. The man who had walked through fire and led men to victory was now helpless in a hospital bed. Weeks later he passed away quietly, ironically in the very type of place, a hospital, where his actions had once sparked outrage. His death shocked the world, but history would remember him differently than those who had witnessed the violence in Sicily. Patton was a hero to some, a monster to others. His methods were extreme, his anger terrifying, but his brilliance undeniable. The men he had struck, who had survived, carried with them a complicated legacy. Scars of fear, yes, but also of survival. The slaps, once a scandal, became a footnote to his larger story. The same ruthless energy that had caused scandal was the force that had liberated Europe. Eisenhower had known it. The Allies had relied on it. The world had needed it. Patton was never meant to be a gentle man. He was a weapon, a storm, a force of nature. And the war demanded such men. History judges Patton with mixed emotions: admiration for his genius, horror at his cruelty, awe at his unrelenting drive. He was a man of contradictions, a savior and a tormentor, a hero and a bully. Yet one truth remains undeniable: the victory of the Allies in Europe, the speed of liberation, and the defeat of Nazi Germany were inseparable from the brilliance and madness of George S. Patton. The story of the slaps, the apologies, the exile, and the redemption serves as a reminder of the human cost of war, the thin line between genius and madness, and the complex nature of leadership in times of unimaginable pressure. In the end, Patton's life and career were proof that victory often requires harshness, that brilliance is not always kind, and that history does not forgive weakness, but it does reward courage, aggression, and relentless drive. The lion had walked among men, roared in fury, and left an unforgettable legacy. And as Europe rebuilt and soldiers returned home, the story of Patton's wrath and genius became legend. His actions, brutal, terrifying, brilliant, reminded the world that sometimes to save millions, one must unleash a force that is both feared and necessary. The war was over. The lion had fallen. But the shadow of his fury and the lessons of his life would echo forever.